Hi, welcome to the grades 10 through 12 book video. I'm Dr. Shannon Whiteside, Program Director for the Alveary, and I'm here today with a few of our curriculum developers, Carrie Forney, Catherine Avery, Danielle Merritt-Sinceri, Dr. Meredith Donaldson-Clark, and Dr. Max Stabenow. This is the 10th year of the Alveary, and we are so excited to give you a preview of some of the books we'll be reading for the 25-26 school year. If you want to learn more about the Alveary, you can browse our viewbook, which is linked in the video description below. The viewbook also contains a free term of art lessons for you to try out. I want to reiterate that we are just highlighting some of the books that are part of our curriculum. There are many more. I also want to remind you that although the books are an important part of the lesson, there is more to a lesson plan than reading and narrating books. While Charlotte Mason cautions us as educators against the temptation to over-explain, she encourages teachers to share brief comments to rouse students' interest and prepare them to engage with the lesson. In Alveary lesson plans, we often give discussion questions, pertinent background information, links to pictures or maps, and other similar activities, so you can put your class and yourself in the right attitude toward the lesson. For high school students who are often working more independently, the lesson plans are written to both students and teachers and often function as the thing to help a student rouse their interest in the day's work.
Yeah, and before we jump in, you might also find it helpful to just take a minute and watch our videos on how we go about choosing books. We covered the questions that we ask ourselves as we're selecting books and thinking through decisions, and that gives you the background to understand our goals and the information that you really need to tailor the curriculum to your students. So maybe click over to those videos now, and we'll see you back in a second.
Let's begin with Bible. Charlotte Mason considered Bible lessons a critical part of a student's life. She wanted every day to bring new thoughts of God, new hopes of heaven. She didn't want Bible lessons to be moralistic and for students to feel like the Bible is a list of do's and don'ts, but for students to know God as their Father and King and Jesus as the Savior of the world. From 7th grade through high school, students read through the Old Testament chronologically. Next year, they'll be reading Joshua through 2 Samuel, as well as 1 Chronicles, along with the Psalms that were written during that time period. They will use this resource, Old Testament Today, A Journey from Ancient Context to Contemporary Relevance by John Walton and Andrew Hill. This book will be used for several years as they read through the Old Testament and gain a deeper understanding of interpreting the Bible. It is so important for students to understand the context the Bible was written in and what it meant to the original audience. However, it's also important to understand how the Old Testament writings are relevant to us today. The authors do a wonderful job communicating those ideas. We'll provide guidance in navigating this book, as well as other links from the Bible Project. After reading Acts and a harmonized version of the Gospels in 7th and 8th grades, high school students move into the epistles and the rest of the New Testament. One of the Gospels is read as well each year. All passages are studied with the aid of Bible resources and commentaries as appropriate.
One aspect of the Bible lessons is the study of church history. Just as in U.S. or Canadian, world, and ancient history, we want students to get to know the people that lived in the time period being studied. Seeing how God has worked in the lives of people in the past encourages us that he is still at work today. One biography that we'll be studying is A Short Life of Jonathan Edwards, written by George Marsden. It's a wonderful introduction to one of America's greatest theologians. Marsden captures the brilliance of Jonathan Edwards in a very engaging way. Students will discover that Edwards struggled with discouragement and uncertainty like we do sometimes, and how he even questioned his own salvation early in his life. Students will read how God brought him through those difficult times and how studying God's word brought peace to Edwards that he would cling to for the rest of his life. Students will also have a window into Edwards' family life by learning about his remarkable wife and seeing the positive influence that she had on her husband and their children. Another aspect of Bible lessons is spiritual formation. These books strand the lessons to serve to encourage students' spiritual growth. We are excited to be using for grades 10 and 11 a book called Friendship with God, A Path to Deeper Fellowship with the Father, Son, and Spirit. It aims to make John Owen's masterful work, Communion with God, accessible to a 21st century audience. Students will be led on an exciting journey that fosters a deep love for the triune God of the Bible. The author accomplishes this task by exploring how each member of the Trinity relates to followers of Christ in distinct ways while still maintaining a unity within the Godhead. The author's writing style is very accessible and engaging. And another book in the spiritual growth category is Knowing God's Truth, an introduction to systematic theology by John Nielsen. It is a very accessible book. Nielsen does a wonderful job of taking complex doctrines and explaining them in an approachable and engaging manner. He demonstrates that understanding and applying right theology to daily living is how Christians mature in the faith. And to assist the reader with applying right theology, Nielsen provides a prayer at the end of each doctrine that encourages the reader to ask God for understanding and how to live according to that specific doctrine.
Max, I read that short biography of Jonathan Edwards a couple of years ago, and I just think it's such a fascinating window, not only into like what's going on in church history, but how Edwards is kind of representative of the zeitgeist of the times across the Americas, especially. And I love how he juxtaposes Edwards' life with Franklin in the early chapters, especially. And like, I just never thought about Benjamin Franklin and Jonathan Edwards being in the same space. And I think it just really shows too the way that all of the different subjects really round out students' understanding, not only of the subject, but of the whole time period we're studying too.
One thing I appreciated most about the book was how Edwards was removed from his large church pastorate. He felt led to take a small church on the fringes with only 18 families. And he was content to move his whole family there and to serve there. And he had no plans on leaving until Princeton came and asked him to come. And even then he wrestled with it. So he was content to be at a large church or content to be obscure on the fringes. He just wanted to serve and teach God's people. And I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, and I think it's true, like Catherine was saying, this integration of the subjects, it's not any different than what we see even in art, right? Like art is bringing in this historical aspect and this different components of understanding not just the subject of art, but it's amazing so how it all goes together. But so discussing art though, let's take a look at what's happening there. All students will be studying the same main artists over the year, but the lessons increase in depth as the students grow. This year, we're studying paintings from Francis Barlow in term 1. He was an illustrator and an engraver and one of the first artists to depict the natural world, especially the sport of English hunting in his artwork. So that should be really fascinating. And then term 2, we'll be studying Rachel Rausch, who was a still life painter. She was around during the Dutch golden age of art, and her artwork sold for a lot of money during her lifetime, and she was a highly sought out artist. And yet, a lot of us, that's not a name that we even recognize. And then for term 3, we'll study John Singleton Copley, who was thought of as the first American artist because he lived and worked around the time of the Revolutionary War and painted many portraits of the men who would become America's founding fathers. Contrary to popular belief, he was not a great American patriot, but a British citizen, loyal to the crown until death. So we're excited to offer 2 new courses also for high school students in this realm, art history and a fast track art just for high school students. So art history is an elective that will build on the many picture studies that the students have done through the years by combining interesting art projects paired with the various art movements on the timeline. And then the fast track art will be for those high school students who, for various reasons, did not have much art instruction through the lower years, and now in high school would like to grow in this area. So the course will take many of the main ideas from the art instruction courses and combine them into 1 year of art study. I'm very excited about the new art classes for high schoolers. So if you feel like maybe you've been lacking in that area with your students, we have the perfect courses for you. So let's look at architecture. One of the fascinating books in architecture this year is Home Building and Woodworking in Colonial America. It has wonderful line drawings that are great for a book of centuries, and it details the process of house building from the wood to the iron hinges on the door. We will also continue with the 50 buildings you should know, which provides an overview of famous architecture from 1650 to 1800.
For geography, we're covering a different range of topics from cartography to regional geography to historical geography. And some of the really interesting historical geography selections from this year deal with navigational issues and understanding the size and the shape of the world and the universe. And a lot of these were just really sort of unresolved mysteries in the 18th century. So one of the books that the 11th and or the 10th and 11th graders are reading is called Chasing Venus, which follows several scientists attempting to get to various places on the Earth to record the transit of Venus in order to use the data to calculate the size of the solar system. And the extent to which the people went to get the data they were looking for is really mind-boggling and inspiring too. Um, and the book does a great job of giving just a picture of what some parts of the world other than North America were like in the 18th century. And then a sort of second option to that book is The Race to Save the Lord God Bird, which is quite the unique title. And it centers around the story of the Lord God bird, or otherwise known as the ivory-billed woodpecker, and its path to extinction. So the story is set in the American South and Cuba, as scientists still debate about the fate of what happened to these amazing birds. And it's an interesting way to see how maps, especially, are utilized to track changing habitats. And then the 12th graders are reading a book called The Measure of the Earth that follows scientists to South America to gather data to help them figure out the shape of the globe as well. So lots of shapes of the globe explorations.
Yeah, which again just shows you this, if you were to just look at, okay, here's what's happening in geography, but it just flows over into all the different subject areas, which I just find so amazing about what Mason was doing in using these great books. And the fact, yeah, talk about exciting adventures, that it's really a page turner to the extent that these people went to get this data, which we don't even think about as all that important nowadays, in the sense of we're not like, why would you need to go watch the transit of Venus? But it's pretty astonishing when you read the story.
One of the things I love about the history of geography and cartography is just to see how fluid it is in the forms of what the images of the globe and of the world could have looked like. We sort of see maps now and think, well, there's no other way they could look. But in the time period that we're studying, there's a lot of people thinking about representation and how to accurately represent the shape of the world. And some of the ideas that they come up with are really fascinating and just show differences in how they viewed description and representation from what we expect now in 2025.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. All right, so let's move into talking about history. The history of our world has a lot of wonderful moments, and it has a lot of dark moments too. We believe a balanced approach is the best way to learn history. As Christian scholar Ronald Wells states, honest history means more than merely telling the truth in factual terms, but also telling the truth in all its complexity and ambiguity. We want our students to humbly pursue a deeper understanding in their engagement with the past. Just as the people in the Bible were full of human frailty and blind spots, so are the people throughout all of history. We believe that when we approach history with honesty and an openness to seek the truth as best we can, students can be transformed in their hearts and minds as they enter into a dialogue with the people from the past and strive to understand their stories, their contexts, and their worldview. If we just imagine historical characters as one-dimensional figures, we'll either make them out to be an idol or a monster. And the only way we can love our neighbors is to know their stories, hear their joys and hurts, and show an interest in their lives as people created in the image of God. That's the power of history approached as a living subject. The ideas and people students read about from the past can affect them today as they process what it means to be an image bearer, what it means to love your neighbor, and what it means to be a part of the kingdom of God. Knowledge without love puffs up. It must be balanced with love and empathy. So this year we're studying the time period of 1650 to 1800 AD in the US and Canada and world history, and then 550 to 100 BC in ancient history. In US history, we're finishing a book started last year that all the high school students will read called American Colonial History. This is by Thomas Kidd, who's a well-published Christian historian and has taught history for many years. And in this book, he tells the story through the themes of religion and conflict. He continues to be a great guide as we walk through this time period. And if your student is new to the Alveary this year or to ninth grade, it will not be a problem to pick up the story in the middle of the book. So another book for US history is Founding Brothers, which looks at several key events in the last decade of the 18th century, bringing in people like Washington, Hamilton, Burr, Madison, John and Abigail Adams, and Jefferson, and just looking at their words and their actions and their different perspectives on a variety of issues that are coming about and are happening in that decade. So it's a really interesting way for students to look at the fact that there wasn't just a single perspective on these different things that were happening, right? The world is having lots of conversations going on about these different things. So that's been a really a fascinating read. And then for world history, one of the books that we include is called Vermeer's Hat, which is a really different title. The rest of the title there is The 17th Century and the Dawn of the Global World. So it's dealing with global trade and the interconnectedness of the world that's really happening at this point. It uses a few of Vermeer's paintings and the items in them to demonstrate these ideas. It's a very unique and engaging read, and I found it's so amazing to think about the things that we take for granted because of how like things are coming from all around the world and we just think it's normal. But at that time, when some of those trade routes and the things that were happening and the different relationships between the countries were what was developing, that wasn't something that people just took for granted, that you could have things from all around the world. So it's just a really I think it's a really clever way of looking into these things using, pictures, pieces of things from Vermeer's pictures.
In the next school year, 2025 to 2026, we will have more content for Canadian families as we are introducing a stream of Canadian history for high schoolers. The grade 10s will learn along with the grade 9s. One of the things that they'll do is learn about the period through reading and reflecting on primary sources, as well as oral histories, and learn more about how history is put together. One book, however, that I'm really excited about is Tyler LeBlanc's Acadian Driftwood, One Family and the Great Expulsion. This will be read by students in grades 9 through 12. It's an interesting background. Tyler LeBlanc grew up in Cape Breton. He had no idea that he had any kind of Acadian history. He'd been told a certain story about where his family had come from. And it was only in talking to a genealogist that he got the idea that he should start to look into it. And it turns out that he is descended from Acadians going back hundreds of years. And one of the things that this book does is it follows his ancestor and 10 of his siblings after the expulsion. Their journeys were all different, as the Acadian people after 1755 were scattered throughout North America to England and France, among other places. And as we follow these 11 people, we are going to learn also about the wider events of the latter half of the 18th century. This book is also interesting because it's a work of creative nonfiction, which is perhaps a genre that some students haven't encountered before. And it shows a real personal connection between the subject matter and the author. He takes all of the speech from actual diary entries and letters, but he elaborates a little bit on how people might have felt about the circumstances in which they find themselves, connecting it to what we also know about the wider history. one of the reasons I really like this book is that it shows how history of hundreds of years ago can feel less remote and how it can have a profound effect on those living today as they realize that they're living connections to what they're reading about that took place so long ago. Another way we will learn the history of pre-Confederation Canada is through historical fiction. We will read the novel My Indian by Chief Misael Joe and Sheila O'Neill, both members of the Mi'kmaq First Nation of Newfoundland and Labrador. It's the story of Sylvester Joe, who was the guide to William McCormick, a man born to a Scottish family in Newfoundland. He decided to set off on an unprecedented trek through central Newfoundland to find the last remaining traces of the Beothuk people. And he took Sylvester Joe, an Indigenous hunter, with him as a guide. Cormac's notebooks record only My Indian as the evidence of the person who led him on this journey. So this novel then reimagines this journey from the perspective of Sylvester Joe and his desire to protect the Beothuk people, which conflicts with his need to fulfill his commitment as a guide. It's also a really engaging introduction to Indigenous culture, as the book opens with the marriage ceremony of his parents, and we learn about Sylvester Joe's early life and the traditions of his community. One of my all-time favorite quotations is from George Eliot's Middlemarch, where she writes, "For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." By unhistoric here, she means those small everyday actions that are unremembered and disappeared from memory. But one way we can recapture these and not only learn about the past, but grow our empathy is through historical fiction. And so grades 11 and 12 will read Shadows on the Rock by Willa Cather. This is a quiet novel. It's not a novel with big battles or epic adventures. Instead, it's the story of a year in the life of widower Euclid Auclair, the apothecary to Count Frontenac, and his 12-year-old daughter, and their day-to-day life in Quebec in the close of the 17th century. This novel is very much a series of vignettes that show the connections between these fictional town people and the wider history of New France.
Let's talk about literature and poetry. So, as we've mentioned throughout, literature is also tied to the time period, especially in these upper grades. So, depending on the lesson, you might be emphasizing the stylistic or literary aspect of something, or you could be emphasizing the historical, but a lot of books are all really dovetailing with each other. So with poetry, students begin the year with Milton, reading several books of Milton's Paradise Lost, sort of begins the time period we're in. And then they're also reading Homer's The Odyssey, which goes along with more of the ancient history timeline. And then, obviously, they're also reading shorter poems as well from poets like Sir Juan Inés de la Cruz, who was known as the Mexican Shakespeare, and then Phyllis Wheatley and others like that. And then for poetry study, where students are thinking more about reading and writing and understanding and thinking about poetry forms and stuff like that at more depth, they are reading this new book called Word Made Fresh. And it just came out in 2024. And they're reading, grades 10 through 12 are reading essentially about the first half of the book, where he focuses really on sort of practical approaches to poetry and how we can enjoy it and love it and understand it more. But he just has such a relational approach that just resonated so much to me with Mason. Like, one of the chapter titles is Think of Poetry Like Friendship, which sounds a lot like a relational education and the type of thing that Mason would say. So it's really also a great book just as a teacher resource for teachers, parents to read. The second half sort of has a theological reflection on the value of poetry. So that part isn't scheduled for the students this year, but you should read the whole thing just to get inspired about poetry in general, and to also use it as a conversation springboard with your students too. And then for Shakespeare, students are continuing to read Shakespeare's plays with the younger kids, and the ones selected for this year are Macbeth and Much Ado About Nothing and Henry IV, Part 1. And then we're also reading a couple historical fiction texts written during the time period to give students a wider sense of the time. And one of them that the kids are starting the year with is The Scarlet Letter, which is, such a famous American classic that's set during this time period, even though it's written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which sort of introduces students accidentally to someone coming up next year. But we're using this, or recommending, you can substitute any edition you have, but we're recommending this beautiful edition that's edited and annotated by Karen Swallow Prior, who's a professor of literature, has taught literature for many years and a writer. And it just includes it's a beautiful book, first of all, because it's just this beautiful hardcover. But it also includes an introduction that's actually meant to introduce students to the text and set them up to understand it and read it well, not just give any spoilers and give more of an academic introduction, but more of like a reader's introduction. And then there's also really helpful discussion questions at the end of the book, which will be helpful for students to just think more deeply about some of the themes and the symbols, especially that are sort of at work in this story. So that one is really interesting. And then another period text that they're reading is called The Celebrated Cases of Judge Dee, an authentic 18th century Chinese detective novel. So this is kind of a new find for us and is translated by Robert Van Gulik. And despite an unfortunate cover image that you might want to edit, the book is actually a fascinating collection of 3 interconnected detective stories. And, it's written over a century before Sherlock Holmes. So it's just kind of remarkable in that it gives students a window into this fascinating text that's getting written over in Asia during our time period. But then also sort of at just the level of the story, it's historically interesting because the translator did a lot of research to make sure that the depiction of the 7th century, so the author's writing in the 17th century and he sets the story in the 7th century in China. And the translator did a lot of research on just like the penal, like legal system and making sure that he was really understanding what was going on in these stories. And he chose them specifically because he felt like the stories were accessible to an English speaking audience, but also really representative of the culture. And also just interesting morally, like the Judge Dee, who's the hero sort of in the main detective, is a very morally upright character. And there's just a lot of thought-provoking questions and themes of, what does it mean to enact justice to everyone, regardless of rank or money, and what does it look like to be an authority, and exercise that authority well, both when you're thinking about having people in authority over you, as well as those who are underneath you. So yeah, I just think it will bring up a lot of interesting questions for, especially the 10th graders are reading this one. And then the 10th graders are also reading this book called My Brother Sam is Dead, which is historical fiction and a Newbery Honor book. And it puts kids into New York during the time of the American Revolution. And the main character, Tim Meeker, has a brother who enlists in the American Army. And then his father is a loyalist. So it really helps kids wrestle with the complexity of the war and just kind of questions about the cost of the war and whether it was the only way to accomplish the independence and the representation that the American colonists were fighting for. So that one is fascinating as well. And then the 11th and 12th graders are also reading the Ramayana. It's a retelling by R.K. Narayan, and it's the Indian epic it's been around for a long time, but it became especially popular during our ancient history time period. And it's sort of it's a quest story where a prince is banished from his kingdom and he has to overcome obstacles to get back, and also has thought-provoking themes about obedience and humility and leadership and sort of virtue in general. And then sort of round things out, they'll end the year with an Austen novel, because Jane Austen is writing and living right at the end of the 1700s and then into the 1800s. And the 9th and 10th graders are going to read Pride and Prejudice, and the 11th and 12th graders have the option to read Sense and Sensibility. And again, there's this beautiful edition that is edited and annotated by Dr. Pryor. And she also shows why Austen is relevant for both boys and girls. So I also appreciate that about her introduction and comments.
Catherine, you mentioned Milton. One of the stories of Milton that I've really clung to, after he completed his graduate studies, he finished rather disappointed. He felt like he didn't learn as much as he had anticipated. And he was in a position where he could spend the next 5 years reading every classic that he could get his hands on. He was a voracious reader, and he just kept digesting every book he could get. Fast forward later in life, and he actually went blind and was no longer able to read, but he was able to draw from all the resources that he had read earlier in life. And so, for our students to be able to feast on these books, who knows how long they'll be able to draw from the material and the lives of these fascinating authors.
Let's talk about English. In grade 10, we'll be using style, the basics of clarity and grace, to start introducing students to the idea of revision and editing and learning how to write not just for themselves, but for others. This is a classic text that covers 10 writing concepts that affect how a sentence sounds to readers. Different chapters focus on things like cohesion, emphasis, concision, and more. We're also studying etymology in 10th grade with the book Caesar's English 2 by Michael Clay Thompson. Of course, students also spend several lessons each week actually practicing these ideas as well and continuing to learn how to write summaries, outlines, verse, descriptive scenes, and more, as they learn how to have fun with words and how to use words well and wisely in a variety of ways as they move on in life and school. In English, students continue to work on honing their skills at a wide variety of written forms, from descriptive writing to summaries to essays. We're using Michael Clay Thompson's Academic Writing 2 as a reference as students work on citing sources, understanding logical fallacies, and a few larger papers over the year to prepare them for academic writing in college. We also use Steering the Craft in 11th grade to help students learn and pay attention to narrative techniques in their own and others' writing. This also helps encourage students to keep having fun with words in their narrations and compositions. In 12th grade, students will read Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies, which we really like to help students think further about the ethics of communication and how we love each other with our words.
And integrated into the English courses, as well as multiple of the different subjects, is just kind of a consideration of how we can use technology in multiple ways to communicate. So we incorporate things like infographics or PowerPoints as potential ways to narrate or work on various projects and compositions throughout the year. And then we actually have a new technology course as well. That's an elective for high school students that we're developing and releasing this year. And that's just to provide more opportunities and direction and thoughts on how students can think about technology and use it wisely. So they'll, have the opportunity to dip into everything from graphic design to JavaScript and coding. So that's really exciting too.
Let's talk about high school science. Our flexible high school science program is ready to be fitted to your students' needs. So for more information about that and all of our high school elective options, be sure to check out our high school science program intro video. For our 10th graders, we recommend Novare's General Biology text. I love the scope and sequence of this text. Miss Ayala begins with the molecules of biology and works her way up to the human body, ecology, and evolution. I think the text reads well, and the author does a beautiful job conveying the science as a complement to one's faith journey. We're also holding space in this course for The Fool and the Heretic. This is a really important book in which two scientists who are also Christians and who hold opposing views regarding evolution engage in meaningful dialogue for the sake of kingdom building, so you won't want your student to miss that one. This course comes with our custom lab manual as well, because you can't relate to the universe of things without the things. For our 11th or 12th graders, depending on their math placement, we recommend physics. Now, I don't actually have a book to share with you for this course because we love the Living Lecture course from Math Without Borders. Mr. Chandler does a really fantastic job teaching this course in a very relevant and practical way. Students learn about the concepts of basic physics by analyzing and modeling the moving objects from the world around them, and I think your students are just going to love it. In addition to physics, we've got a number of elective courses that students can take based on their interests and their goals. One of my favorite books from our botany course is The Hidden Life of Trees, and we're using the illustrated edition from that book. So the knowledge and perspective in here is just fascinating, and the photography is stunning. I actually had to steal it back from my children to be able to show it to you today because they are so tied to this book, and all the beautiful pictures in there. Carrie, what are some of your favorites from the elective science courses in high school?
Wow, I have so many favorites. One is microlife. Still there. It's part of the microbiology elective, obviously. And again, the photography is amazing in this book as well. But take a look at this, right? Like, what do you think that is?
Wow, that looks like a coconut.
I
Or
know.
a date.
Or a what?
A date.
A date? Okay, interesting. Yep. So this is a zebra longwing butterfly egg. Who
Wow.
knew, right, of the beauties of God's creation that are unseen by our human eyes without the aid of a microscope? The tiny pores on the ridges in this is what helps oxygen reach the embryo inside. This book is full of things like that. I can't, yeah, I could show you pictures from every page. It's really amazing. So that's definitely one of my favorites. Another one is from our botany course as well, called What a Plant Knows. And this delves into the wonderful world of plant senses. It's just showing the variety and complexity again and beauty of how God designed plants. And then for each course, we obviously have a lab component or field studies that emphasize that's the emphasis. So students can get outside and see things for themselves. And in astronomy, the 100 things to see in the night sky, it's very helpful for guiding observations. It tells when and where to look for these celestial beauties. And I just find that one, it's like a lifelong fascinating book, right? Because you can always go back and try to find things that you couldn't see before because the season wasn't right or it was cloudy that night or whatever it might be. So it's yes for this elective, but I really think about it as a book that just goes with you for life because there's always time to look up and see what you can see in the heavens.
I can remember the first time that I saw Saturn through a telescope. We were outside of Rocky Mountain National Park, and our friend's kid, he just said, "Hey, do you want to see Saturn?" And I thought he was kidding. And I said, "Well, sure." And he took me to his telescope, and I looked through it, and I was like, I was speechless. I mean, seeing the rings, it was like so moving. And then I pulled back and looked, and I couldn't see anything. And I looked again, and it was breathtaking. I mean, I still reflect on that routinely about how God created those. He has positioned them exactly where he wants them, and they're there by his spoken word. It is just transformative.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the book is really helpful for making it accessible, right? So it's like you don't have to have the telescope. It lists things that you can see with the naked eye, and I just love that about it. It doesn't need to be sort of a exclusive club, right? For only if you have these great tools, which those tools are amazing, right? It brings us or allows us to see things that we couldn't see otherwise. But I love the fact that this book is also showing that it's available for everyone, right? We can see things just by going outside at night, even in urban settings where there's a lot of light pollution. There's still things to observe and take notice of. And then also, I really am enjoying our advanced nature study course. It uses a renowned naturalist, Roseanne Hanson's book called Master of Field Arts, and it takes nature study and journaling to the next level. It has a whole fascinating section on tracking and pigments and sketching and all sorts of things. So it's also really helpful for thinking about it in terms of citizen science options for that, which we build kind of into all the different science electives. So very excited about those science courses.
I love that we were able to actually connect with Roseanne as well and get her to, look at the course considering how much we use her book. So it's fun that sort of she had a hand in it and was able to like give feedback and thoughts.
Yeah, and she's very approachable and accessible. She wants students to write in and show her what they're drawing and painting and observing. So yeah, she's very engaged and excited about the use of her book.
And parents and teachers can take that course as well. I was thinking of doing that course this summer It looks really neat, that book by Roseanne Hanson.
Yeah,
So,
that's a great idea. Yep.
okay, well, so many books, so little time, but our students have the rest of their lives to continue learning, and we hope they will. Thank you for joining us in this preview. You can find more samples on our website, a free set of lesson plans, and more information about the Alveary in our viewbook and on our YouTube channels. We are so excited for the adventures that await both teacher and student this next year.